Alexa, stop. Welcome to the PID webinar. आज हम एक बहुत important topic का आगाज करने लगे हैं. That's as far as my Urdu will run. I'll leave the rest to Musharraf Zaidi. Today we're going to embark on a very important topic, civil service reform. And we're going to do a series of webinars on civil service reform because, to my mind, and I hope some speakers will challenge me on this, that this is probably the most central subject to not only the development of this country, but also the survival of this country. Every state must have a functioning civil service. That is the received wisdom from Roman times to today. And quite frankly, we must make sure that our civil service is up to par. So we're going to talk about it today. So let's begin. We always begin with this cartoon, which I think everybody should always have on their wall. The IMF, the big fat guru, is sitting on the cart and holding the Pakistan government in its reins, hanging loans in front of us. And there's a scraggy landscape. And all the government is doing, or people, I guess, all of us are doing, is running left, right, and center, helter, skelter, in a crisis mode. So that really tells us a lot about ourselves. So today is the first in our series of these webinars, right? And now, please mute your mics. Let the speaker speak first, and everybody will have a chance to speak. Raise your hands as we go along. I'll call on everybody to speak. Okay. We've got a lovely panel today, very good panel. Shahid Kardar, unfortunately, has escaped us, but he hasn't escaped us. In September, we'll call him again for the second webinar. Then we've got Musharraf Zaidi, CEO of Tobad Lab, and I would say this webinar, if Musharraf agrees, is a joint Tobad Lab PID production. Then we've got Humaira Zia Mufti, who is a National Internal Security Specialist. Then we've got Dr. Samina Zahra, Director General NIMS, Karachi, so she's a civil servant. We've got Sameen Mohsen Ali, Assistant Professor LUMS, who's done a thesis on civil service reform. So we've got 4 eminent speakers today, and let's go through them. So I'll quickly set the subject up. The second slide that I always show is the number of fund programs we've done in our history. The IMF is the emergency ward of the world, and our country has remained the emergency ward the longest. We spent almost every decade in the emergency ward. I think we've had fewer years outside the emergency ward than inside the emergency ward. This is worth remembering. The third, this is another common slide that we show every webinar, worth remembering. Our long run growth is going down.
Sir, your slides are stuck, sir.
Stuck, okay?
Yes, sir.
I shall change them. I shall change them. Okay. Oh, God.
Yes, now I'm.
Now my computers. Now
yeah,
my computer.
Yeah, it's okay.
Now.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. You are on 4th slide, sir.
I'll leave it. I'll leave it like this. Okay. Then we've got. Oh, this is very interesting. Now my. I don't know how to do that. Then next, what we've got is the our investment rate is also the lowest in the world and declining. So bear that in mind. We've had a series of PID webinars, and what have we learned? We've learned that the most important thing is poor policy development and inconsistent policy, especially the tax policy. Who do we blame for this? I leave it to the panel. Our transactions costs of doing business, we've learned, are very heavy. HRM is missing throughout the government, which is human resource management, both private and public sector. Private sector state mentality, but does slightly better than multinationals, but it's lacking every. Market development is bad. Energy reform is bad. Cities are bad. These are all problems that we've got. This is something that, again, we show every time and well worth remembering. This is 1950. Our forefathers did know that we would be aid dependent. I don't know whether that's Liaquat or Nazmuddin or whatever, on crutches of dollars. And you can see what our masters, the puppet masters, are saying at the back. So this remains true 70 years later. Now, in the number of we recently did education webinars, and we saw every few years is a new policy. Every few years is a new policy. Yet our eminent speakers, educationists said they don't even know what the policy is, where it comes from. Same thing for civil service reform. We've had about, I guess, 30 reform efforts in our 70 years, including pay commissions, this, that, etc. So it's an effort that we keep making, but we keep failing. What are the persistent problems? The persistent problems of poor governance remain that we've got persistent problems. Poor governance, public sector enterprises keep draining, energy keeps draining, education keeps deteriorating, cities keep getting worse and worse, as you can see from Karachi and Lahore being flooded. Policy is outsourced to the donors. Nobody does any monitoring and evaluation. Now the world has set up a $120 million project to do monitoring and evaluation called Pakistan Goes Global. So the deterioration is secular and keeps happening, and that's what's leading to a long run growth coming down. Persistent problem also, we've got a tribal structure. You just saw today, this morning, the papers had that the PMS has refused to accept the reform that's about to happen or happening. The tribal structure continues to dominate. The PAS, I don't know how many names there are, the acronyms or whatever, the abbreviations, they keep fighting each other. Most important of all, we've got outmoded policies, processes, and structures. Our policies, the way we make policy, the way we do things is very outmoded. As you all know, that we have these sextuplet, triplicate forms and this, that, etc. happening, which is very bad. There's a continuing struggle between professionals and generalists. Continual struggle. The question of pay always comes in. The civil services, they're badly paid. Others say they're not. Seniority is always ruling. Now, these are major issues that we do. A long time ago, when I did the framework of economic growth, I said the central thing is quality governance. Civil service reform is central to the whole government. This is the chart that I still stand by, that we need to think about it. So I asked the panel, who makes policy? Who does M&E? If it's not the civil servant, Ralph Brabanti a long time ago in the India Office Library said it should be the civil service. But nowadays, civil servants, when I go to teach at the staff college, they say, we don't make policy. So who makes policy? Where does it come from? I don't know. Then the civil service says, we can't make decisions because the NAB is after us. Who makes decisions? And why should they make decisions? Many of us have lived overseas. I've lived in the US for 30 years. I have never had any bureaucrat make decisions for me. I never saw bureaucrats in my life in the US or in the UK. I've lived for 5 years in the UK too. So what's the story? Regulation, PSC, and education. Who does this? Why are the bureaucrats involved in this? Are politicians to blame for everything, or are these things technocratic in nature? Cities and local government. Who owns the city? Karachi is drowning. Who owns the city? Who makes the master plan? We are trying very hard to inject ourselves in the master plan. We can't. There are no space for schooling, libraries, anything. Everything is plots. Why? Is this related to the civil service or not? Okay. So cities and local government we've done. So my panel, I ask you, should tribalism persist, or should we have one civil service? Should we have these structures? Should professionalism come in? Should policy be made by the civil service? Should decentralization, autonomy happen? Can all this be done without a civil service reform? Is civil service reform central to our struggle? So with that brief introduction, I'd like to go to Musharraf Zaidi to kick off the discussion. Musharraf, floor is yours.
Thank you, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Thank you, Dr. Nadimul Haq, and thanks to the great team at PIDE. I must say that the series of events that PIDE has been holding is an exemplar for thought leadership in this country, and I greatly appreciate and value this contribution. And of course, I'm honored that you've asked me to work with you on this and to discuss this topic. So, you know, and given the paucity of time and the great panel that we have, let me dive right in. Just one small caveat to begin with, which is that there's no animus in anything that anyone will say today. And I think we need to start with this caveat whenever we have these conversations.
Very good point, Musharraf. I agree with you entirely. Thank you. I missed that.
People express, you know, how they understand the situation, sometimes coldly, sometimes with great passion. If they do it with passion, it's because they care, and we should recognize the fact that they care, even if we feel that you're under attack. If they do it coldly, we should admire the rational mind that enables them to deliver their message in that way. I've been working off and on civil service reform throughout my career. One of the first things I did when I first moved back to Pakistan in 2001 was work on, at that time, the version of civil service reform that was a conflation or a convergence of a World Bank effort, some work that the ADB wanted to do, and the internal reform instincts that were being driven by the National Reconstruction Bureau with General Tanveer Naqvi. And the late retired Major General Asim Bukhari was in charge of civil service reform think tank at the NRB back in 2000, 2001. That registers on the list of civil service reform efforts as 3 efforts ago. Over the last 2 decades, we've had at least 2 macro and I think several micro efforts at civil service reform. So I want to start with sort of 4 key points that are interconnected, and to make those points, maybe to start off with what was a micro civil service reform. So if you think about people like Rashid Langrial and others in the Punjab government that got to be well known because of the projectized assignments that they were given by the chief minister at the time, Shahbaz Sharif, and that was then problematized as some sort of a public administration fiasco. That was a version of civil service reform. It was micro because what they were looking to do was achieve a specific set of objectives rather than change or alter the system or examine why the system wasn't meeting those objectives as it was. So one of the reasons why things like civil service reform are important is because in the absence of civil service reform that is macro and wholesale, we will keep attempting tweaks. So that was an example from 5 or 6 years ago. A more recent example is the NCOC. I think the NCOC is one of the most, so I thought that what Shahbaz Sharif was doing back in 2013, 14, 15 was brilliant. It helped achieve what that government sought to achieve. And I think what the NCOC has done and what it's demonstrated is also brilliant because it has achieved a policy coherence at the national level on COVID-19 response. It has gotten over the hump of some of the problematized federalism, and it's demonstrated how federations actually can work when national level issues are dealt with through a coherent approach that involves and respects federal jurisdictions and provincial autonomy. But both the NCOC and the proliferation of public companies in the Punjab 13 to 18 are representative of the shorter version of what should be a much more comprehensive and cohesive civil service reform effort. My thesis is that civil service reform, one of the problems we have is we use this terminology, but we're not actually talking about reform because neither what Moin Afzal or Moin Qureshi or Hamid Nasir Chakta or the Fakhr Imam Commission or Ishrat Hussain 1 or current Ishrat Hussain 2 or any of these, they were not actual reform efforts. They were tweak efforts. They were meant to identify specific problems that had mostly something to do with Islamabad's interests. And specifically within Islamabad, Q block, P block, R block, as well as the PM Secretariat, Chief Executive Office, PM Office, whatever name you want to give it. But basically, executive governance problems that are problems for Islamabad were treated like they were national problems, and the solution, which were a number of tweaks, were advertised or marketed as reforms, which they are not. That's the first big civil service reform problem. The second big civil service reform problem is connected to that, which is purpose. When we start the civil service reform effort, I mean, I was really, and again, I have huge amounts of respect for Dr. Hussain, indeed for anybody who's tried to serve this country in any capacity. So again, this is not a personal or even a political set of statements. This is just an assessment of what has happened. And what has happened with the most recent effort is, again, the urgency of what was needed in this country, which was, for example, increased tax revenue, has driven the civil service reform effort. And so a lot of the focus of reforms is on the FBR. Notwithstanding what actually has happened at the FBR and what our judgment is, but fixing the FBR is not civil service reform. dismantling the customs group, maybe civil service reform. But these conversations we haven't been having because it is seen as almost blasphemous for us to talk about the dismantling of a totally dysfunctional, broken, outdated, archaic, and corrupt system. So I think one of the things that it is the responsibility of people like me to do is to actually stop being sort of nice for the sake of, you know, appearances, because the fact of the matter is that the civil service reform that we think is happening is not civil service reform. It's tweaks, and it isn't trying to solve problems for the people of Pakistan. It's trying to solve executive problems. Unless we rejig the purpose, I'm going to finish in less than 3 minutes, inshallah. Unless we rejig and reassess what is the purpose of sitting down and examining this question: why should a state have a civil service? What is the primary, secondary, and tertiary purpose of a civil service? And then what changes do we need to make to what we have to align with that purpose? If we don't start there, we will keep having events like we've had at Chaman Spin Boldak over Eid. We were spared a massive massacre, although 7 to 8, human beings died over Eid. That is a civil service reform problem manifesting itself through bullets. In Karachi, we're seeing just the most imagery. And that's just today and yesterday. But we've seen the misgovernance and destruction of one of the potentially great metropolises on the planet because we don't really understand what civil service reform is and how the brother of a politician who's inserted into the provincial service can become a DC in a city like Karachi. Speaking, of course, of Maulana Saab's brother who was made the DC recently. How a city like Karachi can suddenly have 7 districts from 6, or why? These are all related deeply. These are not dotted lines. There's a thick black line between what we see in the news and the conversation about civil service. And unless we make that connection, we will keep failing. My final point: you have to connect what matters to the people of Pakistan, whether you judge it through what's on ARY or Geo, or whether you judge it through what's in the manifesto of the winning party, or whether you judge it through the narrative of the chief minister or prime minister. So you have to connect what matters, and a whole number of things could matter. You have to connect that with the actual public sector, which is not just the civil service, it's actually the organizational and institutional organograms and dynamics and relationships that define and shape the behavior of individuals who we call civil servants. So connect what matters with that entire edifice of where the civil service is located with the concept of reform. And reform is not tweakery. It's not, changing the names of things. It's not trying to make sure that the PMS's ego is as well fed as the PAS's ego, which is as well fed as the Pakistan Foreign Services ego. All of these things have to be connected with each other. You have to connect what matters with the edifice of civil service, with the notion of genuine reform. And unless we don't do that, then all of the details, and there's so many details we can discuss, and I'm sure we will actually be meaningless. And this is why we keep failing on civil service reform. Thank you.
Thank you, Musharraf. That was very, very good. You summarized it very well. I think it's important to understand, and first of all, I think you get the disclaimer, which is excellent, which is very good. I should have said it earlier myself. None of what we are doing is against or for anybody. What we are trying to understand is the institutions of Pakistan. As everybody knows, why nations fail, everybody has read. Institutions are the most important thing for economic development and growth. And civil service is an important institution of the country, which we must understand, just like judiciary. We're going to take up judicial reform very soon. These are important things to talk about, and it's important, as Musharraf says, to have a conversation on these. So Musharraf, I know you have to leave early, so I'll come back to you very quickly, but let me take it now to our next speaker. I can't even get my bloody internet to work. So terrible, isn't it? It's absurd. Okay, G, let me get to our next speaker. Go ahead, G. Please. Why don't one of the speakers take over while I'm
Dr.
searching for
Samina Zia, Humaira Zia.
G. Humaira Zia? Please go ahead. Start, G. Humaira. G. Humaira?
Okay. Thank you very much
The
for
computer's
having
acting
me.
up. I'm sorry.
Thank you very much. I think Musharraf Saab was reading my notes and I'm going to point out the same things.
Okay.
Well, first thing is I see the failure of the civil services and the decline that we are facing as a national security threat, because our failure to perform leads to the economic crisis that Pakistan finds itself in. It's related to the performance that we make at PATA on Kashmir issue, on all the issues. The performance of civil servant is very important when we look at the crisis situation that Pakistan faces itself in. How it's a national security threat, the civil services itself, because it's one of the pillar of the national security, just like the army and the defense forces, they protect the boundaries. But the internal defense and the economic development, the growth, the financial markets, the security situation inside the country depends on the civil servants. And I think civil servants do write policies, they write visions, they write documents for which they have no information. They might get posted to any ministry like 3 months back and they are faced with a new government where they are asked to prepare a policy, for example, an energy policy. So a person who's serving as a deputy commissioner ultimately gets posted as secretary energy, and there you see the energy crisis coming. So I think a lot responsibility should be fixed when you give authority to a person. It was the federal secretary who was responsible in preparation of that policy, and the bureaucrats who are implementing those policies. The other thing is that we have seen these policies and groups formed over and over again. What is the purpose of the reform, of the civil services reform, I may ask? If the purpose of the reform is meant to continue the hegemony or monopoly of one group that we have seen throughout, that is not going to serve the purpose. If the purpose of the civil service reform is the economic development, growth, and providing service to the masses, then that service reform will be valid. And also, when you are reforming the civil service, you have to see where the service delivery point is. It is at the district, it is at the tehsil level. If the common man does not receive the services that the state is supposed to offer, you see alienation, you see marginalization, you see terrorism and extremism. So I think when you assign a deputy commissioner to a province, to a district, he's expected to check the rates of the vegetables and also check the rate of the drugs and check on the conditions of the roads, and also implementer of the law and the policies of the state at the district level. I think the local government reform has to go hand in hand with the civil services reform.
Baby, I'm sorry, I have to interrupt here. Who assigned the civil servant these tasks? I mean, nobody has asked them to check prices and do all these things. I think this is a task that they've taken upon themselves.
I think that is the misunderstanding of the role that they're supposed to perform. Because the deputy commissioner was actually a colonial setup, that we are continuing with that colonial setup to this date. So unless you empower the cities, unless you allow the citizens to participate in the governance of their district, and you create a system of localized accountability, that will give resilient cities, that will give resilient societies. So when I was going through the civil services reform, I saw that until 1969, you had a commissioner ruling Balochistan. And FATA, until now, is being governed by a political agent until just recently we had this FATA reform and we had the FATA merger. So you think that a province of the size of Balochistan remain under a commissionerate, and you see that marginalization and alienation up to this date. And the problem of security in FATA is because the people were not provided the rightful share of being the citizens of Pakistan. So I think it's a national security issue right now. And if we fail to reform the civil services now, I think then there's no need for the civil services, because if your countries, despite having a army of bureaucrats, you fail to give an economic policy, a continued economic policy to this government, or the energy policy to this government, or the water security for that matter. So there's no need for us. The bureaucrats are not required. If the country is growing at less than 2% and it fails to feed the population of Pakistan, I think it's something really serious. So what should be done then? How to take the reform process forward? If you look at the committee formed by Ishrat Hussain Saab, look at the groups who are represented in that committee. Out of the 17 people, how many DMG officers? It's not about the voice of one group or the other. It's about listening to different point of views where people express themselves, not for favoring OMG or Secretariat or any other group. It's for making the reform people-friendly, where the service delivery and the governance and the transparency is increased, and the accountability as well.
Thank you, Humera. Thank you very much. Samin Mohsen Ali, you did a thesis on this subject. So what can you tell us very briefly is the upshot of your thesis? Let's just forget the past. Going forward, what are we supposed to do? Are we going to be stuck in this quagmire forever? That's why I call it an existential issue. So Samin, please go ahead.
Thank you. So let me just begin by clarifying that my thesis is actually about how bureaucrats and politicians interact with each other. And as part of doing that, I came across issues of reform, and some of my work has been on particular kinds of reform. But a lot of it is essentially how do bureaucrats deal with each other and how do bureaucrats deal with the political figures that they come into contact with. And that actually, I think, tells us a lot about the direction that civil service reform, whether of the minor tweaking variety that Musharraf was talking about, or the structural change that Ishrat Hussain Saab is envisioning, it tells us a lot about all of those things. So let me just briefly run through some points. I think the first thing is that we have to figure out what is the purpose of the reform, right? So are we trying to balance the budget? Are we trying to improve service delivery? Or are we doing civil service reform because we think that government is failing as a whole? And so there's this fairly broad set of ideas that we are bringing into the agenda. The second thing is, how do we think about incentives when we go into reform? So what are the incentives of not just the bureaucrats who are going to be reformed, but also politicians, lobbyists, crony capitalists, everybody else who might have some interaction with the government, and of course, most importantly, the citizen. So obviously, as we all know, nobody who has gained power from the status quo wants things to change. And perks, rewards, inefficiencies are part and parcel of that incentive structure. But I think what we kind of need to think about with more nuance is that perks and privileges and rewards and inefficiency are sometimes a matter of design. So it's not just a byproduct, it's not just about corruption, it's not just about wanting to make money. It's about the fact that the system has been designed to serve certain constituencies, and part of that design is inefficiency, part of that design is perks and privileges. I'm saying this for two reasons. I'm saying this because perks, privileges, inefficiency, all of this is not a big secret. It's a very visible part of our governance structure. You can see it in Karachi, you can see it in Lahore. So it's not some secret thing that's happening. The bureaucrats are secretly pocketing money. The second is that Pakistan is by no means exceptional. There are many countries which have very similar patterns of bureaucratic and political behavior. In many countries, just like in Pakistan, there are at times small pockets of what are known as pockets of effectiveness or pockets of efficiency where things start to go really well for a small period of time, and then things sort of revert back. And this goes back to what Musharraf was referring to in terms of micro level tweaking. The question is that when you have things that work well, are they working well for the citizen? Are they working well for the state as an entity? Or are they working well for some other interested parties, whether those are bureaucrats or politicians or some third party? There's a lot of interesting work on other countries on these subjects. So for example, Yuan Ang on China looks at the use of a franchise model, where what the Chinese government did was literally created something like a McDonald's franchise, where the bureaucrat and his department would get a cut of the profits that he made if he increased, or rather they increased their performance with regard to other districts or other departments. And this was meant to incentivize bureaucrats to perform. So Asim Khwaja, Ben Olkan do similar kinds of experimental work, which can tell you what minor tweaks can do. But let me also say that I think it's a little simplistic to portray bureaucrats as Machiavellian or self-interested in the pure sense. It's important to bring nuance to this, because I think it's important to understand that there are many different kinds of people within the bureaucracy, within the PAS, within the larger structure. And I'm going to talk about a section that kind of gets overlooked in this discussion of civil service reform that we have so often in Pakistan, and that is the bulk of the bureaucrats who are working on the ground, frontline or street level bureaucrats. This is something that gets very little attention in Pakistan, even from an academic standpoint. And their training, their education, their staffing levels, and the departmental support that they receive, and their understanding of the way that governance functions is really, really crucial to how we think about civil service reform. And I think we need to change our perspective a little bit. So what I'm saying is that I think we pick up this reform conversation from the wrong end of the bureaucratic hierarchy. And I'm going to use an example here from my research, which is on irrigation management transfer. So one of the things that happened was that IMT reform was a reform that was introduced by the World Bank. It was made one of the conditions for loans in the 1990s. But once it was implemented, it fell apart because neither the local district bureaucrats nor the local politicians, MNAs or MPAs actually wanted to devolve power down to the farmer to decide how water should be regulated. So the fact that you have these centralized notions about civil service reform, you can implement them, you can try and implement them, but on the ground, these things will start falling apart the minute that they get into the hands of local actors who have either not been consulted or who think it's a widespread conspiracy to undermine Pakistan, and this is a common refrain with these kinds of centralized programs. So when we talk about political will, and this has to do with politicians resisting reform at the local level, we hear this often, कि political will nahi hai civil service reform karne ke liye. What does that actually mean? This term is actually fairly simplistic and meaningless. What do you mean when you talk about political will? What I think you mean is political processes, contexts, and choices that allow some decisions to be made, but don't allow other decisions to be made. Some reforms to take place and be implemented and be successful, but not other reforms to be successful. So why do some minor tweaks work while others may not? So these kinds of questions are really going to help, I think, in a conversation on civil service reform in this country, as they have in other places. There's also something I wanted to pick up from what Ms. Merazia said, which is that local level involvement is important from a local government standpoint. So when you have a federal civil service commission talking about reform, then it's trying to make decisions for very diverse provinces which have very diverse needs from their civil servants. And so there has to be engagement with all the tiers of government involved. So just to quickly wrap up, I mean, there's a bunch of other things that I would have liked to talk about, but we don't have time. So how do we deal with this fairly messy situation? I think there's a few points that are important. One is that you cannot talk about civil service reform in this or any country without talking about the political economy of the country. So we can introduce changes such as better training, better pay scales, better policies for promotion and transfer. And these will make a difference because they will give us some evidence base. But we will always run up against incentive structures, and so we'll have to overcome them. How do we do that? We have to understand that civil service reform is not a one-off thing. So you can't just have a commission and then dissolve it and then say, okay, we're done and dusted with civil service reform. This is an ongoing process that has to underpin all of your policy making, all of your legislation, and all of your decision making. So you cannot on the one hand have civil service reform and then at the same time be making a bill which gives undefined powers to a bureaucrat or gives them so much space well beyond their remit, whether it's because you've created a vacuum or because you just don't have the skills to do it yourself, so you've handed it over to a bureaucrat. So you can't do that while talking about civil service reform at the same time. we also need to understand the bureaucratic politician dynamic. So when in conversation with bureaucrats and politicians, each side will dismiss the other. कि इनको कुछ नहीं पता, ये colonial हैं, elitist हैं, ऐसे हैं, वैसे हैं, इनको कुछ समझ ही नहीं आता, etc. You'll hear these comments from bureaucrats and politicians alike. But the reality on the ground is that they cannot survive without each other. And so reforms, structural reforms, threaten both of them. And so whoever is proposing reform needs to be, one, in a position of relative stability, so long-term stability. And secondly, they need to be willing to get their hands dirty because the process will be messy. There will be camps that will not agree, such as the PMS, such as senior bureaucrats, such as the FBR, which basically said we don't accept the suggestions of the Civil Service Reform Commission. And finally, reform is a slow process. It's not something that you can achieve in a year or 5 years. It's a 10, 20, 30-year process, and you will not see the gains till 10 or 20 or 30 years later. So we've, perhaps taken baby steps in that direction. So maybe we've, through the reforms that Ishrat Hussain Saab and his committee have suggested, we are starting to build evidence-based, consolidating posts and offices, updating the ASTA code and rules of business. But this is quite literally a baby step. And the real work lies well ahead of us. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you very much. Let me turn to Samina now. Samina is Director General of NIMS. Samina Bibi, what's your take? I think we've heard a lot that civil service reform can't be done holistically, can't be done immediately, has to be done slowly. But then Musharraf says tweaks are not important. It's a huge problem, and you're sitting at the heart of the system, which is the training center. How do you want us to look at the civil service reform issue? Samina? Is Samina there or not? Nabil Sahab, dekhiye mera tum.
Dr. Samina Zahra, we are unable to hear you. Sir, Dr. Samina Zahra, baat kariye, sir.
Can you switch off your mic? Sorry, what do you call it? Unmute yourself.
Sir, her mic seems to be unmuted.
Acha. Ji Samina Bibi, boliye. Sorry, no, we can't hear you. Have you got your mic on?
Madam, if you are facing an issue, kindly rejoin.
हाँ मेरा ख्याल rejoin कर लें. Meanwhile, let me come back to you, Musharraf. Musharraf, paint for me. What would be your ideal civil service reform? I mean, I hear everything that everybody's saying. It's an insoluble problem. It's like the famous Gordian knot or something. But there has to be a solution. And quite frankly, I don't see enough discussion or debate or research on this subject. So can you start it off and start the conversation, tell us what should be done? I agree with you, tweaks won't work, and I agree with all the things that people have said. But we have to, the whole point is for us to start a new conversation. So go ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Saab. I think Dr. Samina is back.
Yes, can you hear me? I'll let Musharraf Saab finish if he wants to take
Go
this
ahead,
point.
Samina Bibi.
No, I'm keen to hear what you have to say, madam. Let's hear what you have to say, and I'll respond.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Okay, thank you, Dr. Saab. Okay, so what I'm going to say on civil service, I hope everyone can hear me now.
Very well.
Is a blend of various perspectives, actually. The perspective of a civil servant, of course, and a trainer who's training civil servants. The perspective that I got during my stint at Institutional Reform Cell last year. And most crucially, my perspective as a citizen living in Karachi for more than 20 years. Partaking in the suffering caused by the governance disaster that we face each time torrential rains that happen. I wish I could share some of the images from Karachi. I'm sure some of you must have seen them. So my perspective is very much affected by what's happening in our lives since yesterday. Since Musharraf Saab said that whatever reform effort has been undertaken so far is no more than tweaks, I want to go a little bit into the detail of reform effort that was done through Institutional Reform Cell, since I've remained a part of that cell for about 7-8 months. Institutional Reform Cell was created in September 2018, and it had a two-pronged mandate. One was to restructure the umbrella federal government structure, and the second was civil service reform. And quite a few things were proposed, initiated, and got approved by the cabinet. Two task forces were constituted. One was for the restructuring of the government. The other was for civil service reform. And I understand that since then, the scope of institutional reform cell has been expanded manifold. And now Dr. Ishrat Hussain is also looking at reforming FBR, PIA, Trade Development Authority of Pakistan, Trading Corporation of Pakistan, and Pakistan Railways. Then there's a financial management chapter to this reform effort, where State Bank Pakistan related reforms. You must have recently read about the creation of pension funds. Public financial management law has been introduced. Auditor General Office is also being looked into to be turned into a more effective and efficient office. Federal government bodies were reorganized from about 345 into 345 entities, which is 100 less than previous structures. Ministries and divisions was merged for improved functional alignments. PFN law was introduced. There's now a debt management unit in finance division for advising the government on fiscal management and also regarding public debt management policies. There's been a competitive selection process introduced for CEOs of public sector enterprises. And I think by now, so far, 40 people have been hired through this selection process, while erstwhile this was very much a sort of a discretionary process. And as far as civil service reforms are concerned, at the outset, institutional reform cell started with a deep and broad engagement with civil servants, not only the CSS cadres, but provincial and non-cadre officers like the agri-economists or the technical cadres or engineers. And Dr. Ishrat Hussain, along with me and later on other team members, we visited all 4 provinces and many, many cities to engage with the civil servants. So I want to sort of rebut Humaira's point that, you know, it's not a very, very well represented effort. I'm by no means trying to defend what is being done there now, but I just want to put things in perspective. So when this reform effort regarding civil service started, the idea was to take up the entire value chain, the entire life cycle of civil service and reform it. So we started with induction, where initially it was proposed that there should be a screening test and then cluster-based exams, which was of course proposed by the task force, of which you yourself was a worthy member. And then there was a reform regarding the next step, which is training. There was a lot of emphasis on the need for having specialized trainings, not only for cadre officers, but also for the ex-cadre officers or the technical or professional cadres. And for the first time in I think, many decades, even the professional cadres, which are the larger chunk of the civil service, the CSS officers are only a fraction of the civil servants. They are also being trained. The next step was performance management, which in my personal view is the weakest link, and I'm going to talk a little bit in more detail about that in a bit. But a concept of performance contract was introduced, where the PM is to have a performance contract with the line minister and the minister with the secretary and so on and so forth. And there would be key performance indicators for each and every person working in that organization, which will translate into specific set of objects. And there'll be a concept of bell curve performance management. Promotion rules have recently been notified in January 2020, which are meant to distribute the powers of CSB and PER in a more equitable manner. Retirement rules have been recently notified, which give a directory retirement sort of power to the government of Pakistan to get rid of the deadwood or the corrupt elements of the civil servants. So all in all, this is by no definition tweaking. It is a substantial effort. We can have an argument about how far this is going to be effective or when this is going to be effective. And here I would like to agree with Samin that any reform process is a slow and painful process. We are not going to have miracle solutions. We're not going to see any results in a year or two. This is going to be a midterm to long-term effort. So after this key overview, I just want to quickly touch upon 2 points which are very close to my heart. And I want to draw the attention of the audience to two aspects of civil service reform. First is the need for having specialists, having professionals, which Dr. Nadeem has been advocating very strongly for some time now. And, the right person for the right job, instead of the current scenario where everybody is trying to get everything done and nothing gets done in the end. There is ad hocism galore. Karachi is a case study towards that effect, where, lack of specialists in the fields of disaster management, water and energy solutions, waste management have become a Frankenstein, which doesn't seem to be in anybody's control. Now, you see, I'm reminded of Einstein's saying where he said that we cannot solve our problems with the same thinking that we used when we created these problems. So we need to have, we need to start having at least conversations and planning. This is the right time. If this is not the right time, when it would be to have some future planning, where public service delivery becomes the centerpiece for our governance structure, instead of, any political agendas or what one party thinks is right or the other party thinks is right. It's not about just cleaning gutters. It's about restoration of waterways. It's about relocation of homes and shops. It's about regulating informal property sector. So we need specialists, we need professionals to run a metropolis like Karachi. And this is the time that we start giving it a serious consideration instead of having those ad hoc solutions for these huge problems. The second point that I want to quickly make, and this is my last point, is regarding the performance management. And it's not just about a system of performance management. That is all well and good. Having performance contract and key performance indicators is excellent. But I'm more concerned with the web of mediocrity that we as a nation seem to be caught in. I remember having a conversation with Shahid Kardar Saab, since he's a dean of an institute. And I recall the feeling of gloom that set over me when he told me that most of his students, they lacked work ethics and basic integrity levels, and much to be desired. So it's probably a national temperament where we are caught in a low equilibrium of expectations. Not much is expected, and we don't really deliver much. The point is that you can't really look at civil service reform in isolation from the social context, political context, as Samin also pointed out. Civil servants are only a mirror of your society at large. And I agree completely that there is a need for comprehensive reform. I agree completely that there's a need for introspection on the part of civil servants also. But I also believe that we need to have bigger conversation, longer conversations regarding where we are as a nation. But I do want to end by saying that reform is a slow, long, painful process, and we have to be really patient for us to see results and maybe keep contributing the way we can. अपने हिस्से की शम्मा जलाना बहुत जरूरी है, डॉक्टर साहब. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ji. Thank you, Samina Bibi. Thank you very much. Musharraf, before you go, unravel this mess. I don't think I have understood anything. 70 years is not long enough for us to reform the civil service. Do we waste another 4 generations? Do we have an administration that works? We are all pointing to the mess of Pakistan, and yet we say, hey, we can't do it. We have to wait another 70 years. Please tell me, unravel the mess.
Ji, thank you, Dr. Saab. Rabbi Shrari Sadri Wasirli Amri Walul Uqdatim Min Lisani Yafqahu Qawli. I share that dua because that's Moses's prayer, so that he may be understood. And I also share it in the spirit of, this is a difficult conversation, and I really want to enter and exit conversations by creating a coalition of the willing. I don't know if it's necessary or useful for us to debate the semantics मैं कहता हूँ tweaks हैं. Dr. Samina, who's a great servant for this country, is absolutely brilliant, spoken of extremely highly across the board. She says it's not, let's split the difference. Fine. It's, we can define it differently. Where I think I will take I guess the road less traveled for me at least, and disagree with Dr. Samin, who I think along with Adnan and a few others really are the most important voices in this conversation moving forward. But where I will differ with her and with Dr. Samina is on the notion of how long reform takes. So I align very much with your view, Dr. Saab, that 70 years is long enough. 20 years to mujhe ho gaye is conversation mein. And there is a repetitive Saiba mentioned the debt office, and if she affords me the luxury, I would remind her and all viewers that the Fiscal Responsibility and Debt Limitation Act of 2005, which was passed in September 2005, established the Debt Management Office. It was supposed to have 3 DGs, one of whom was supposed to be from the civil servants and 2 were supposed to be from outside. Now, who wrote that little bit of reform is an interesting question. Why was the Debt Management Office set up? Nadeem, you know the answer to this. We were under something called a PRGF program from 2002 onwards. And the PRGF IMF program instituted a number of conditionalities or conditions. One of them, we call them policy outcomes or DPIs or LPIs or something. They keep tweaking. Just like Pakistan, the World Bank, and all the other donors keep tweaking as well or reforming. So that kind of reform changes the language, but essentially it was an IMF imposed diction that caused the establishment of the Debt Management Office. The fact that we've renewed it and we believe that we've set it up again, that's fantastic. And again, I think the idea is, I think Dr. Ishrat Hassan and others that have been involved in these conversations, there's an element of heroism because they're up against a whole lot of status quo that is pushing back and resisting any kind of change at all. So tweak ho, reform ho, agar thodi cheez bhi badal rahi hai, jaise maine pehle kaha, NCOC is not really reform. It's a tweak or it's a bypass, but it's a great bypass and it should be celebrated. Shahbaz Sharif companiयां बना के काम करवा रहे थे क्योंकि departments नहीं कर रहे थे. Fantastic. We should have found a way of protecting that space rather than destroying it. So I think the interest in the short term is can we get stuff done? But in the long term is being clear-headed, clear-eyed and honest about what we're actually doing rather than what we pretend we're doing. That's why I made the point about the semantic point, which I'm happy to concede. You asked where do we begin in terms of making sense of all this. I would go back to what Samin I think reconfirmed for me and Madam Humera and I think to a great extent at least the undercurrent of what Dr. Saiba Nijo Farmaya, that is that we have to be very clear about what the purpose of all this is. Is it to build the economy? And is the best way of building the economy following the World Bank's checklist on ease of doing business and increasing revenue? Or is building the economy unleashing the telewala and the kokewala and allowing them to become as big as Malik Riaz? Is a focus on corruption helpful or harmful? Is infrastructure necessary or wasteful? There's a whole range of conversational questions about tonality and modality of conversation that are much more important in my view than the actual, in this area, they want to talk about performance measurement. They want to talk about pay and pensions. They want to talk about even incentive structures. You were the Deputy Chairman Planning Commission. One of the big wins during your time there, another reform or tweak, whoever, we'll go with, again, whichever, was कि गाड़ियों को monetize करना था. गाड़ियां monetize हो गई. At the highest level, 90,000 रुपए महीने का जो है, उसके एवज आपको तनख्वाह में एडिशन हो गया. हुआ कि गाड़ियां तो हुकूमत की उसमें थी, ओनरशिप में थी. वो एस्टैब्लिशमेंट डिवीजन में पूल बना गाड़ियों का और वहां से 22 और 21 ग्रेड के जो असर वसूख वाले अफसरान थे, नॉट बिकॉज नेसेसरली बहुत बुरे थे, इविल थे, करप्ट थे, not because DMG mein koi kharabi hai. You know, I think that's the one point that I'll leave on, and I'll speak for just another couple of minutes. But I think if there was one point that I could leave with all of us, in fact, probably the most important aspect of this conversation, you're in the conversation to attack civil servants, to pinpoint individual cases of maybe malfeasance, or agar aapne koi siyasat ki apni dukaan chamkani hai through this conversation, then you're not helping the reform conversation, you're damaging it. The most important stakeholder after the poor and vulnerable Pakistani in this country is not me or Dr. Nadeem ul Haq or even Samin Mohsin. It's actually the civil servant herself or himself. So I think that doesn't mean that this conversation will run kare. So to the extent that we shouldn't demonize DMG or customs or any PMS or whichever occupational group, we should not demonize them. Does that mean that hum sabko hat jana chahiye? DMG or PA वो गलत कि जो है अच्छा मैं अल्फाज इस्तेमाल किए इस पे भी ऑफेंस लिया जा सकता है लेकिन institutionally, not individually, institutionally, what is happening in this country is a sustenance of a colonial superstructure which creates incentives that align interests of various aspects of the state, and the judiciary, the provincial and federal civil service, and the military are part and parcel of that. Any entrants and exiters from the system, mostly politicians, but also technocrats, they become allies of the existing system to sustain the status quo and to prevent reform. So Dr. Samina, Ishrat Hussain, Hamid Nasir Tatta, Fakhr Imam, whoever we're talking about, World Bank, Nadeem ul Haq, anybody that's talking about reform is an ally. Everybody that's involved in reform is an ally. There is no occupational group that is a bad guy. Civil servants are one of the great assets. OMG or DMG, they're an absolute asset. The state has invested in them. The taxpayer has invested in them. We own them, and their voice is important in how we move forward. But they are not the ultimate determinants of what should come out of this process of conversation and reform. The ultimate determinants are what is best for the poorest and most vulnerable Pakistanis and taxpayers. And so that complicated set of alignments must be managed carefully. And the most important thing in this is no villains, no heroes. We just have to find a way of sustaining a meaningful, substantive conversation. I'm extremely grateful for the opportunity, Dr. Saab, and apologetic that I'm not able to.
Okay, no problem. But I agree with you, Musharraf. Just before you go, let me say thank you very much for turning up. Thank you very much for turning up. But let me just quickly, before you go, say this. Look, all the way from Hamza Alvi to Khalid bin Saeed to whoever, there has been a huge literature that has paid tribute to the civil service for holding Pakistan together, right? And for doing the early work of state building. So there is no question about it that civil service is a bad guy or anything. Civil service is absolutely imperative, important, does a strong task. So we are not at all being critical of anything. We are just doing an
I just want to, just one final thought, Dr. Saab, one final thought. It wasn't just in 47 or 71. Every time there's a calamity, abhi jo Karachi mein ho raha hai, the people that we demonize are going to be the ones that are going to be at the front line. They're going to get sick. They're going to have heart problems. They're going to get injured. You know, and they're going to literally give life and limb to serve the country. So civil servants were not just heroes and back in the day. Throughout the COVID experience, our DCs and ACs have been on the front lines. Our doctors are also, unfortunately, the definition of civil service is broad. So I think they're heroic and they must be protected, but they must also not have a free reign to determine what the future course of the country is. That's a collective conversation.
But having caveated the conversation now, we don't need to go do that anymore. Let's proceed to the issues. For example, let me put it before the panel. Can we go anywhere without decentralizing? We have a huge problem with centralization. Even within the ministry, the secretary runs everything. Even within the attached department, they report to the secretary, and everybody's line hazard before them. For example, VCs, I've heard complain that our files don't move, additional secretaries, deputy secretaries, etc. Regulatory agencies are all complaining. Second thing, autonomy. No agency, not even a university or anything is autonomous in this country. Everything is related through attached departments. Is that an efficient system? Third thing, professionalism. As we said, for example, professionalism is nowhere there. Even doctors retire in grade 19 or 20. Seed and technologies people retire in grade 19, 20. Irrigation officers retire in age 19, 20. Where are the professionals? Why can't they rise to the top? They used to in the old days. Third thing, do we have trade unions? Should these groups behave like trade unions, or should there be a general civil service like in England or UK? Then another point that I want to put to you, what about work processes? We've heard a lot from Samina just now on many things, and I don't dispute anything at all. But I'd like to ask, for example, she mentioned PFM. I know who wrote the PFM law. PFM law was written by Oxford Policy Management. Musharraf has already told you about. I have a whole slide which I should have probably put on. In the last 10, 15 years, almost all the economic laws from NEPRA to PEMRA to whatever have been written by donors. So I ask you again, who is doing the monitoring and evaluation? Every time you ask for anything, it happens, the World Bank or some donor doing it. Then what then is the job of the civil servant? If they're not making policy, if they're not doing NMND, so we are setting up this performance system for what? Only because they should do what? I don't know. So what is the purpose of, what is the civil service doing? What are their tasks? Can anybody tell me, please? If Musharraf is not gone, you can take the first crack. If you're gone, then go ahead. Anybody from the panel? Samina Bibi, you want to take it? Or Samin? Or Humaira, whoever?
Let me bite and say a little
Please.
bit about recruitment. I think is one of the things that we can talk about. So I think we have to understand why people come into the civil service, right? So why are, I mean, of course we can change the exam and we can, change the training, but why are people opting for the civil service in increasing numbers, right? And I think, I mean, I'm perhaps someone has done some research on this. I haven't seen it, but I think there's a few key issues. I mean, one is obviously this aspect of power and prestige, right? Even if it's actually a hard slog in terms of the actual job, the perception is that it brings you a level of power and prestige that no other job will bring. At the same time, I think increasing numbers of applicants are also a sign of, deeper unemployment across other sectors. So this is an option that the state is going to hire. The state is going to give you perks, privileges, pension, job security. And so if you can get through the exam, you're set basically, and your family is set for life. And those are, excellent reasons. If those are your reasons, there's nothing wrong with that, because, there's a level of responsibility that everybody has to cater to themselves and their families. But I think we need to understand why people opt for these jobs. And we also need to find a way to make sure that those who come in are not, and those who are idealistically coming in are not left hardened and cynical, a couple of years, 2 or 3 years into their service, and then looking for ways out, right? And there's plenty of ways out, whether that is going on study leave, whether that is going on deputation with third-party organizations such as donors, or whether it is clashing with a significant figure, whether bureaucratic or political, and being OSD or Khudde line, as they call it. So apart from the training and so on, when we look at the life cycle of the bureaucrat, I think we need to think about these things in terms of motivation and treatment through the course. I think the point about local government or autonomy that you raised is really important, because, and this is like another hobby horse.
Sorry, it's not just local government. Sorry, Samin, it's not just local government. Take Punjab University, for example. Does the Vice Chancellor report to the Secretary, Higher Education, or is he independent? Is he like the Vice Chancellor of Oxford, Cambridge, or Harvard President? Or is he beholden to somebody? He's hired by the Secretary of Higher Education. So, I mean, we have to talk about autonomy at many levels. For example, is NEPRA. NEPRA is regulating our energy sector. Who is it responsible to? I mean, these are important issues that we have to take into account as analysts, don't we?
You're absolutely right. Whether we're talking about local government or district bureaucracy or attached departments or semi-autonomous departments, whatever particular category we want to pick, I mean, in some ways, the story tends to be quite similar, which is that the story is that those in positions of power, again, whether political or bureaucratic, want to centralize, right? That's their preference, whether you look at the 18th Amendment or you look at these autonomous departments. So one of the things, for example, post 18th Amendment, which you can actually see the repercussions of even is that the implementation of that act was subject to reversals. And so you have reform proposals now under Ishrat Hussain Saab's committee, which are saying that, well, why are these particular departments or offices under the federal government? They shouldn't be, they should actually be with the provinces. The other thing that I was noticing in looking through their documents is that despite the amendment being passed, the number of federal civil servants has increased since 2010. So effectively, you are not devolving power, you're going in the opposite direction. So if you're not willing to concede powers to the provinces, then you're not going to concede them to the district, whether it be elected government or whether it be bureaucratic. What you're pointing out about vice chancellors and department heads and secretaries is absolutely correct, because if you are in the secretary's good graces, then that opens up doors for you later on as well. So when the secretary moves, he might say, oh, you know, like, come along with me to this new department and, you know, I'll give you a good post. However, all of that being said, there are also ways that less connected bureaucrats exercise power. So Matthew Hull has written about this. The way that paper moves through a bureaucracy is a means for non-connected, non-well-connected bureaucrats to exercise a significant amount of power. So for instance, if a bureaucrat wants their pension approved, that file is sitting on a fairly junior bureaucrat's desk, and it's in their hands, the section officer's hands, to figure out when that file is going to be lost, or is going to reappear, or is going to be forwarded, right? So that's basically an exercise of power. So when you allow for the secretary to dominate everything, the secretary knows that there are certain goings on happening at the lower levels, which he or she is going to have to overlook, because otherwise the department won't function. So there's a level of autonomy that is there, but it's autonomy that isn't necessarily helping in terms of, you know, citizen service or service delivery. I'll stop.
So Meena Sahaba, can you tell us, how is this issue being dealt with in the reform that you're saying is happening? How will departments, attached departments, get more autonomy? How will the file not have to move? For example, why does the file not have to move in UK or US? No file moves there. Why should a file move here? Why is everything not in policy and automatic?
I agree with you.
Is that not a part of the reform process? Or is reform only that bureaucrats should take more decisions on us?
I think it's bizarre that a vice chancellor of a university should be, you know, answerable to a bureaucrat for his academic decision making. I think in principle, I do not have any issues with what you are saying. But the complexity of the issue at hand is such that top of my head, I cannot offer you an answer to this.
Let me ask you another question. For example, in this day and age, when we have CNICs, I have to go to a bureaucrat to get my CNIC attested. Is that something that reform can't take care of today?
They can, of course they can, and they should. And probably this is where it all should start, actually, you know, attestation of CNIC. When you can authenticate the data from your central data bank, then what's the need of authentication? I completely agree, it doesn't make any sense. But I think this also has to do with you know, our mindsets and our cultural, this clinging to certain notion of power or whatever. It's somehow built in our semantics, and in addition to all these reform processes that we are undertaking, probably we also need to sort of liberate ourselves from these issues. There should be a serious thought regarding how to unburden ourselves with these from these colonial legacies. But I completely agree. Unless there is autonomy, unless there is decentralization.
क्या हमें 70 साल और इंतजार करना है इन चीजों को ठीक करने में, या ये एक स्ट्रोक में हो सकती हैं? इसमें कौन बेनिफिट कर रहा है कि हर चीज की खातिर?
I think कि अब ये attestation वाला शायद इतना issue officer का नहीं है. Probably family member can also attest it. But I wonder where is the need for that also.
अगले दिन मैंने करवाया टेस्ट.
अच्छा, वो आपसे किसी ने डिमांड किया होगा कि मुझे ब्यूरोक्रेट का ही अटेस्टेड चाहिए.
क्यों? Why? ये रूल क्यों नहीं खत्म होता? Why is it that we cannot change these nuisance rules? कि 6 कॉपीज लेके आए, 5 अटेस्टेशन लेके आए, 15 दफ्तरों के चक्कर लगाए, ये जो चीज है ये तो खत्म होनी चाहिए कि नहीं?
इसके लिए डॉक्टर साहब, I think You know, एक ऑफिस में जो एक 18 या 19 या 20 में जो एक ऑफिस का इंचार्ज बैठा हुआ है, I think it's very much a decision with him or her also. I think इसके लिए कोई इतनी फेडरल लेवल या प्रोविंशियल लेवल की रिफॉर्म्स भी नहीं चाहिए. It has to do with how you work, how you conduct yourself, how citizen oriented you are. So I think this is more of an educational and awareness undertaking rather than a mega reform undertaking. But I agree with you, unless there is autonomy and decentralization and there is an indigenous approach to solutions, localized solutions, we are not going to move forward. I agree with you.
अच्छा मुझे बताइए, for example, another very interesting thing that I think about often, कि जी अब आप लोग ये सिविल सर्विस के साथ PAS लिखा हुआ है, सेक्रेटरी ग्रुप लिखा हुआ है, फलाना ग्रुप लिखा हुआ है, जिसको मैं ट्राइब्स कहता हूँ, या फौज में इसको रेजिमेंट्स कहते हैं. क्या ये 2020 में जरूरी है? बिकॉज यूएस में नहीं है, यूके में नहीं है, कहीं भी नहीं मुझे नजर आता, इवन इंडिया में नहीं है. IAS है सिर्फ और कुछ नहीं है. तो यहाँ क्यों हमने ट्राइब्स में बांटा हुआ है? और फिर ट्राइब्स में एक और चीज है, आपकी जो ट्रेनिंग एकेडमीज हैं वो ट्राइब्स को स्ट्रेंथन करती हैं, वो ट्राइब्स को लेसन नहीं करती. डू वी नीड सच ट्राइब्स? बिकॉज ट्राइब्स में और भी चीजें हैं. फॉर एग्जांपल इसमें इंफॉर्मेशन इकोनॉमिक्स में बड़ी चीजें आ जाती हैं कि नेटवर्क्स बन जाते हैं, फिर नेटवर्क्स पावर होल्ड करते हैं. अब इसको कैसे हम देखें?
I think this might actually gradually go away. जो इंडक्शन की जो रिफॉर्म्स हुई हैं, जिसमें we are going to have 4 clusters. There's एक इकोनॉमिक ग्रुप है, जनरल एडमिनिस्ट्रेशन ग्रुप है, जनरल एडमिनिस्ट्रेशन ग्रुप में and then your technical group. So you know, instead of this PAS and customs and IRS, this is gradually going to go towards professional and
समीना ये तो पहले भी था. समीना ये तो पहले भी था. पहले भी इकोनॉमिस्ट ग्रुप था. प्लानिंग कमीशन बेचारे ग्रेड 20 में मर जाते हैं.
No, but we're specifically talking about CSS officers, not tribal wars.
तो ये क्यों? Why do we have these groups? And why do we have to have an exam? For example, why can't I take an exam? Why does the exam have to be one guy who will be promoted to secretary? Why can't we do it like other countries? कि anybody can exit and enter the civil service. Lateral entry हमने लगाई थी 73 में, पर बंद कर दी lateral entry because हमने कहा ये गलत बात है. तो
I think that door is also going to be opened up through this national executive service की जो proposal है. I'm not really aware कि वो किस maturity के किस stage पे है that proposal, but that proposal is very much there and it's going to provide a level playing field. के subsequently grade 20 में भी अगर कोई enter होना चाहे तो straight उसमें enter हो सके. So that door or that window is going to be opened up soon through this national executive service proposal.
Helen ji, anybody else? जी बताइए. Humera baby, you want to say something?
I think जी sir बिल्कुल.
जी बोलिए.
I have a point to make. जो आपने बात कही कि वो grade 17 का अफसर टेस्ट करेगा, और this is how the rules have been written. And this is how we have made service delivery impossible.
Yeah.
Unless we change civil services reform ke saath simultaneously, you need to reform the way the ministries work, the way the ministries are structured. So jo aap autonomy ki baat kar rahe hain, even when there is NADRA comes under Ministry of Interior. So when you look at when there are certain कुछ examples हैं जहाँ पे organizations have brought about a change the way they work. I was at BISP and BISP shifted from card-based payment system to biometric-based withdrawals. So I think it all depends on what type of officers are serving, if they are motivated and if they are they want to bring a change. But there I faced a problem that the GFR, General Financial Rules, did not allow branchless banking. So when you don't have branchless banking, we are definitely going to invite the audit paras. So it's not only the reform of the civil services, but also the rules under which the bureaucracy works that we need to reform. And coming back to the reform by Dr. Ishrat Saab, I think the good thing that they are doing right now is to catch the people right at the induction level. Because if people are opting for Punjabi as a language because it gives them more marks, that does not shed any light on my intellectual ability or how to check a person's level of motivation. And there are tests where you can check whether a person is going to be more power hungry or be more corrupt. I have been through the recruitment process of the military, few instances that I saw where there was a psychiatrist who was sitting behind, and he gave us a pen picture of the candidate, and we exactly knew what that person would be if we allow him to work in that organization. So I think the Dr. Ishrat Saab's work is is a very brave attempt. And we are facing a lot of, we see a lot of groups fighting over that reform, that DMG will gain more. What about the executive service? Who will have more, which group is going to have more share in that executive service? So I think we should go above these group priorities and group loyalties. I think what is required right now is to improve the service delivery to the common man. They are the ones who are suffering, and the point to start the reform is the district. So if you change the way a district works, if you change the way service is delivered at that point where the common man connects to the state, I think reform should start from at the local level, at the district level, or at the tehsil level, where people have access to education, to the passport office, to Nadra, and the state is connecting to the citizens of Pakistan at that level. And why I said that it's a national security issue right now, because if you fail to provide services to the common man, तो सर जब हम बलूचिस्तान में या फाटा में जो हम इश्यूज देखते हैं या सदर्न पंजाब में रिक्रूटमेंट ड्राइव्स जब होती हैं मिलिटेंट ऑर्गेनाइजेशंस की, तो डेफिनेटली पीपल हु आर politically feeling neglected, aggrieved, they are going to take up arms against the state. We saw that in 1971. I don't want to, I think you guys know more than I know on the subject, so I will leave it at that point. So if the service reform,
आपने बिल्कुल ठीक कहा, डिस्ट्रिक्ट से शुरू होती है बात. मुझे बताएं, मैं ये रिफॉर्म कमेटी में पूछता रहा हूँ चीज़ें कि मेरा शहर लाहौर है, या अभी समीना बीबी ने कहा इनका शहर कराची है. तो कराची के लिए तो डीसी तो एक जूनियर ऑफिशियल है, लाहौर में भी डीसी इज लाइक अ ग्रेड 18-19 ऑफिशियल. मेरा मतलब हम जूनियर ऑफिशियल्स जिनकी स्पेशलाइजेशन सिटी मैनेजमेंट कुछ नहीं है उनको दे देते हैं. Why can't, for example, Ali Chima, जो लम्स का well-known economist है, why can't he be the chief financial officer of Lahore? Why should Lahore not try and get him to be the chief financial officer? Why can't we have this kind of a system where you can target serious professionals and get them to work? ये हमने क्या निज़ाम बना दिया है कि जहाँ के हम एक बच्चे को कहते हैं भाई तुम एक इम्तिहान दो, उसके बाद सारी जिंदगी तुम्हारे लिए पावर गारंटीड है. ये तो मुझे समझ ही नहीं आता, कहीं दुनिया में ऐसा निजाम नहीं है.
सर एक और बात, सर if you look at the PERs, almost 90% officers get outstanding ACRs. अगर इतने ही outstanding है तो मुल्क का ये हाल क्यों है? तो आपका जो PR system है वो सारा नहीं, I think we have to.
ठीक है जी.
I hope so.
समीना भी बताइए, प्लीज बताइए.
I think that's no more possible. I think the extraordinary PERs 20 to 30% को आप मिलेंगी, and you know the formula has been rationalized to include training के marks, training performance marks. So अब वो PER के साथ-साथ training has become quite significant, and I think the formula has become, it's not really perfect, but it's quite equitable now, and it's going to become more transparent gradually.
I would like to do a webinar on training, which I'll ask you to lead, because I think training is a subject that we ignore, and we really need to look at the civil service training, but that be a separate subject. So उस पे करेंगे. And PRs, ठीक है, I agree with you.
Sure,
but I think,
sure.
जी, okay, go ahead. जी, Samina Bibi, go ahead. Samina, go ahead.
जी, आपने बात की कि why can't Ali Chima जो economist हैं वो क्यों नहीं लीड कर सकते? Why can't he be the chief financial officer? With due reverence to जो हमारे economists हैं और वो, लेकिन डॉक्टर साहब आपसे ज़्यादा कोई इस चीज़ को appreciate नहीं करेगा कि academic और practitioner दो बड़ी distinct चीज़ें हैं. लेकिन I agree with you कि कराची को head करने के लिए deputy commissioner नहीं है, एक most seasoned, most senior, maybe much better paid एक होना चाहिए जो कराची मेट्रोपोल को जो कि इंटरनेशनल मॉडल है of running the running big cities instead of a deputy commissioner or a commissioner for that matter. और उसके आगे जैसे मैंने कहा कि कराची जैसे शहर के लिए स्पेशलिस्ट होने चाहिए, डिजास्टर मैनेजमेंट के, वाटर मैनेजमेंट के, एनर्जी स्पेशलिस्ट होने चाहिए, इसके जो बिल्डिंग रेगुलेशंस हैं उनके ऊपर स्पेशलिस्ट होने चाहिए. एंड आई सी अ ह्यूज गैप. So I agree to that extent that we need to have more professionals and specialists in the management of running a metropole like Karachi. I'm not sure if having academics to actually practically run a city is a successful model, but in principle I agree with you.
No, sorry, please don't pull poor Ali Chima in it. That was just an example. I wasn't saying it. My point is we have to bring in some serious professionals.
I hope Ali Chima is not with us in this webinar.
No, that's why I'm saying
let's not pull him in.
Let's not pull him in. My point is very simple. वो तो example था कि I think कि एक junior official को हम DG LDA for example लगा देते हैं और ये दे देते हैं, फिर वो junior official वो यहाँ belong भी नहीं करता, उसका कोई interest भी नहीं होता और वो फिर आगे कहीं चला जाता है साल लगा के. And there's a mess behind. हमें समझ ही नहीं आती क्या होता है. So I think this is an important point, but we'll.
Doctor, if I could just make one point, अगर हम ये junior और senior की debate में चले जाएं, तो फिर ये a little bit of an antithesis of reform हो जाता है जिस तरफ हम जा रहे हैं. Because we are saying that a person with greater potential, greater level of commitment, greater specialization can be a boss. Even if he's 20 something or 30 something to 10 people who are 50 something. So that's what future should be looking like.
When I said juniors, Amina, I mean a DC who reports to the federal government. मतलब लाहौर में मेरा जो represent, मेरा जो बंदा है, उसका लाहौर से कोई ताल्लुक नहीं है. वो तो federal government का employee है. उसका मेरे से कोई ताल्लुक नहीं है. Federal government का employee है और वो junior बंदा है federal पैकिंग ऑर्डर में. जैसे मैं जब रहता था फॉर एग्जांपल डीसी में या शिकागो में, तो एक बड़ी वेल नोन मौजूद है चीज कि ओबामा ने एक पुलिस वाले को क्रिटिसाइज किया बिकॉज वो एक हार्वर्ड के प्रोफेसर को अरेस्ट कर रहा था. दूसरे दिन ओबामा ने अपोलोजाइज किया कि मैं लोकल गवर्नमेंट में इंटरफेयर नहीं कर सकता और मैं प्रोफेसर और पुलिस वाले को बुलाऊंगा टू द व्हाइट हाउस टू अपोलोजाइज. मेरा कहने का ये मतलब है सिटीज की ऑटोनॉमी इतनी होती है. अभी भी देखें ट्रंप शिकागो में ट्रूप्स भेज रहा है तो जो ट्रंप सिटी के ब्यूरोक्रेट्स कहते हैं हम नहीं मानते. लड़ाई हो रही है, ठीक है, चाहे ट्रंप सक्सीड कर रहा है पर लड़ाई हो रही है. तो मैं सिर्फ ये कह रहा हूँ कि सिटी के लिए एक सिटी की अपनी सिटी एक लाहौर इज नाउ बिगर देन डेनमार्क, कराची इज बिगर देन हॉलैंड. ठीक है जी. So these are mini states and they are being run by DC, which is kind of a strange thing. So all I'm raising these questions, हम आगे webinars में और ये करेंगे कि we really need to think about it. It's not about bashing anybody. It's nothing. It's about creating good governance for us. That's all. And it's very simple. There are solutions there. I don't want the PFM to be written by a consultant from Oxford Policy Management or Public Financial Management Law. I don't want all the laws to be written. हमारे parliamentarians तो पढ़ते नहीं laws, तो वो लोग लिखते हैं. तो this state has to somehow change. ठीक है जी. मैं आपको एक और चीज बताऊँ. अभी एक सेकंड. ये भी आपको दिखा. ये मेरे पास ये सिविल सर्विस की एक रिपोर्ट पड़ी है मेरे बाप की पुरानी, मुझे याद है अभी तक. ठीक है जी. ये मुझे ढूंढनी और भी. ये जनाब एक 1955 की रिपोर्ट है. आपको नजर आ रही है सबको कि नहीं?
The Cooperative Inquiry Committee report. Okay. West Pakistan.
ये 1955 में है. ये 200 सफ़े की इतनी डिटेल्ड रिपोर्ट है. जिस वक्त कागज पे लिखी जाती थी चीजें पेन पे. आजकल मुझे दिखा दे ऐसी कोई रिपोर्ट है जबकि वर्ड प्रोसेसर है, सब कुछ है. Why not? And I think that's the key issue that we have to discuss. So anyway, I don't want to hog the seminar. I don't speak normally. Let me take it to the floor and ask questions. शायद हशमत साहब जल्दी से हाथ रेज कर लें because I'll close the thing then. Don't then come up with your hands at the last minute.
Unmute.
जी, you are unmuted. Go ahead.
जी डॉक्टर साहब, thank you very much. एक बहुत ही important issue के ऊपर आपने आज वेबिनार करवाया है. इससे पहले भी एजुकेशन एंड फ्यू अदर वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट नेशनल इश्यूज हैव बीन डिस्कस्ड. मेरे 2 क्वेश्चंस हैं. उससे पहले अगर आप मुझे इजाजत दें तो मैं एक छोटा सा ब्रीफ कमेंट जो है वो देना चाह रहा हूँ. आई डोंट वांट टू बी पेसिमिस्ट, नीदर आई वांट टू बी सिनिकल. लेकिन मेरा अंदाजा ये है कि जो सिविल सर्विसेज रिफॉर्म की बात आप कर रहे हैं, प्रोबेबली नेशनल लेवल पे हम इस मामले में सीरियस नहीं हैं। अगर जेन्युइनली इस सब्जेक्ट में लोगों का इंटरेस्ट होता तो आज के वेबिनार में कम से कम 100 के करीब प्रैक्टिशनर्स को होना चाहिए था। I do not see a single federal secretary. I do not see anybody from the DMG, from police, from customs, accounts, so on and so forth. तो इससे आप इंटरेस्ट लेवल जो है वो आपको अंदाजा हो जाएगा। विद ड्यू रिस्पेक्ट टू डॉक्टर समीना, उन्होंने बहुत अच्छी बातें की हैं। आई डू नॉट नो कि क्या ये हमारा एक कलेक्टिव सोशल नेशनल माइंडसेट है या इसमें वेस्टेड इंटरेस्ट का इशू है या फिर ये कि ये एक नेशनल इनकॉम्पिटेंसी की बात है। आई एम ट्राइंग टू बी लिटिल मोर ब्लंट। जैसे आपने कहा कि आप ये 70 साल से हम बातें सुन रहे हैं, तो मैं भी तकरीबन 40 साल से ये बातें सुन रहा हूं। दो इंपॉर्टेंट इवेंट्स 1973 से लेकर 76 तक, जिस लेटरल एंट्री का आपने जिक्र किया, where the grade 19 and grade 20 officers were inducted, notwithstanding the process, I mean that was certainly not perfect, और उसके ऊपर 2 रिव्यू जो है वो पब्लिक सर्विस कमीशन ने किए। इंटरेस्टिंगली हमारी इस पूरी डिबेट में I do not find a single chairman or a former chairman or a former member of the Public Service Commission, ना फेडरल पब्लिक सर्विस कमीशन से ना प्रोविंशियल पब्लिक सर्विस कमीशन से कोई आदमी जो है वो इस डिबेट में शामिल नहीं हो रहा। कोई प्रैक्टिशनर जो है वो इस मामले में शामिल नहीं है, लिविंग साइड डॉक्टर समीना। एनी हाउ, 2 क्वेश्चंस मैं पूछना चाह रहा हूं, आपने भी उनकी तरफ बार बार इशारा किया है। नंबर 1, ये 30-35 रिव्यू रिपोर्ट हो चुकी हैं, कमेटीज एंड कमीशन एंड दिस एंड दैट, एंड अल्टीमेटली डॉक्टर इशरत जो है, जो पिछले 20 साल से इस सब्जेक्ट में बात कर रहे हैं, वो थक गए और थक के उन्होंने गवर्निंग दी गवर्नेबल जो है वो टाइटल दे दिया इस पूरे मामले को। आई थिंक इट इज अदर वे अराउंड, इट इज अनगवर्निंग दी गवर्नेबल। बहुत हमारा जो सोशल स्ट्रक्चर है उसको अच्छी गवर्नेंस से गवर्न किया जा सकता है। 2 ब्रीफ क्वेश्चन। नंबर 1, इतनी सारी रिफॉर्म्स, इतनी सारी स्टडीज हुई, आपने कभी बड़ी खूबसूरत बड़ी पुरानी स्टडी जो है वो दिखाई है। एक्सक्यूज मी, क्या वजह है कि इन रिफॉर्म्स के ऊपर अमल क्यों नहीं हो सका? व्हाई दीज आर नॉट बीन इम्प्लीमेंटेड? अभी पार्शियल इम्प्लीमेंटेशन की बात की है डॉक्टर समीना ने, बट बाय एंड लार्ज ऑल दीज स्टडीज दे वर शेल्फ्ड एंड द रिकमेंडेशंस वर नेवर इम्प्लीमेंटेड। क्या इंटेंशन ठीक नहीं थी? क्या स्टडीज ठीक नहीं थी? क्या लोग जो है वो थ्रेटन फील कर रहे थे? व्हाट वाज द प्रॉब्लम? नंबर 1। नंबर 2, एवरीबडी एक्सेप्ट्स, पब्लिक सर्विस कमीशन ने खुद एक्सेप्ट किया है कि ओवर अ पीरियड ऑफ टाइम, द लास्ट 3 डेकेड, जो पब्लिक सर्विस कमीशन के कैंडिडेट्स हैं, जो उनका सिलेक्शन प्रोसेस है, एट द एंड ऑफ इट देयर हैज बीन एनॉर्मस डिटोरियोरेशन। जो कैंडिडेट्स अप्लाई कर रहे हैं, जो उनका एकेडमिक स्टैंडर्ड है, जो इंटेलेक्चुअल और ऑनेस्टी का स्टैंडर्ड है, वो तो बहुत बात की बात है। जो आपका बेसिक स्टफ आपके पास आ रहा है, जो बेसिक मटेरियल आ रहा है, गार्बेज इन गार्बेज आउट, आपकी हार्डली 1 से 2% लोग जो है वो उस एग्जामिनेशन को पास ही नहीं कर सकते। व्हाट टू टॉक ऑफ कमिंग ऑन द मेरिट? बेस्ट ऑफ द बेस्ट तो बड़ा बाद में बात आएगा। और अनफॉर्चुनेटली जब से हमने सिस्टम प्री एलोकेशन किया है, nobody is interested in the training at all. When somebody already knows, a candidate already knows that he is going to DMG or he is going to police or he is going to customs, they are least interested in the training. Well, post allocation had some other issues at all. I mean, उनके भी अपने issues थे। तो काइंडली इसके ऊपर कोई कमेंट जो है वो कर सके। आई विश यहाँ पे कोई सीनियर ब्यूरोक्रेट आया होता, कोई सीनियर प्रैक्टिशनर आया होता, जिसने 30-40 साल अपने में लगाए होते, और फिर उसके बाद वो हमारे इन सवालों का जवाब देता। थैंक यू वेरी मच।
I agree with you.
Can I respond, Dr. Sir?
You'll get a chance जी। मैं इन सब के क्वेश्चन ले लूं, फिर I'll come back to you। ठीक है जी? जरा नोट करते रहें प्लीज। ताहिर धनसा साहब। ताहिर साहब बोलें। अनम्यूट। Ab.
Very simple observation, one-liner. The thing is that the bureaucrats feel answerable not to the state of the Pakistan, but to the political government. I was heading a bureau of a news agency, and a bureaucrat would come to me and provide me with documents to fail the government. Tanveer Naqvi was doing some civil service reform, and he was adamant that these are wrong, and he would leak out. Later on, the same bureaucrat was at a senior position with Punjab government with Shahbaz Sharif. One of my buddy, I was in university, he was a medical doctor, and we would study together. He went to the custom services, and now he's an anchor person at some place. So I think this civil service need to be raised to the ground, and a new architect need to be written. If I am not wrong, Omar Hamid, and if I'm not absolutely wrong, I can see Humaira, they were all in EAD sometime. We would go to EAD for so many things, but most of the bureaucrats have never gone out of A, B, C, D, Q, P block outside. So this whole edifice has to be raised on. This is my observation.
Okay. Point taken. ठीक है जी. Rizwan साहब, Mohammad Rizwan. रिजवान साहब हैं, चले गए?
थैंक यू नदीम साहब. मेरा सिंपल सा क्वेश्चन है. डॉक्टर जो प्रिंस, उन्होंने ट्रेनिंग पे एम्फेसिस किया बहुत ज्यादा. तो सवाल मेरा ये है कि आपको जो जरूरत है ट्रेन प्रोफेशनल की है, तो ट्रेन तो जो बंदे मार्केट एक्सपीरियंस होते हैं, जिनका 10-20 साल का किसी भी स्पेसिफिक प्रोफेशन का एक्सपीरियंस है, आप उनको इंडक्ट करें डायरेक्ट, बजाय आप अपने जो है फ्रेश ग्रेजुएट्स को लेके ट्रेन कर रहे हैं. तो वही लेटरल एंट्री वाली बात है. तो ट्रेनिंग तो आपकी सेल्फ रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटी है, आप अपने आप को कितना इवॉल्व करते हैं टाइम के साथ, ये पॉइंट है.
पॉइंट टेकन. महमूद खालिद साहब, लास्ट क्वेश्चन.
Thank you, sir. My question is pertaining to the establishment division's role, because the reforms might take a certain lag, but what could be the role of a kind of an HR which continuously improves upon where to fit the suitable person in the job?
Ji. Samina Bibi, would you like to start answering the question?
Dr. Sahab, मैं जो फर्स्ट क्वेश्चन हुआ था हशाम साहब थे गालिबन या हाशिम साहब थे, प्लीज करेक्ट मी इफ आई एम रॉन्ग. तो मैंने अपनी, कैन यू हियर मी?
जी we can hear you well. Go ahead.
अच्छा, तो उनके 2-3 सवाल थे आफ्टर अ लॉन्ग सॉर्ट ऑफ एन इंट्रोडक्शन. उन्होंने ये कहा कि डिटीरियरेशन है और 1% भी पास नहीं हो पाते हैं मेरिट में क्या आना. तो वो तो मैंने अपनी गुफ्तगू में कहा था कि देयर इज अ जनरल हमारा एक स्टैंडर्ड गिर गया है एकेडमिक और इंटेग्रिटी लेवल और लेवल ऑफ कमिटमेंट. तो इस पे प्रोबेबली वी नीड टू थिंक एज अ सोसाइटी. और आई डोंट नो हशाम साहब किस शोबे से ताल्लुक रखते हैं, अगर वो एकेडेमिया में है.
हशमत साहब, he is a former army general. जी.
अच्छा, ओके. आई थॉट कि अगर एकेडेमिया से हमारे पास कोई होता तो वो इस सवाल का ज्यादा अच्छे तरीके से जवाब दे सकता कि हमारे जो ओवरऑल स्टैंडर्ड्स हैं वो क्यों गिर गए हैं. बट आई एग्री विद हिम. लेकिन मैं एक और डायकोटमी की तरफ पॉइंट आउट करना चाहती हूँ कि जो हमारे सिविल सर्वेंट्स हैं, अगर आप उनकी एक क्रॉस सेक्शन की स्टडी करें तो दे आर प्रोबेबली मोस्ट क्वालिफाइड पीपल इन द कंट्री. जैसे जितने PhDs और मास्टर्स और फॉरेन क्वालिफिकेशंस आपको सिविल सर्विस में मिलेंगी, शायद कहीं और नहीं मिलेंगी. अच्छा, दूसरा उन्होंने ये कहा था कि रिपोर्ट्स इम्प्लीमेंट क्यों नहीं होती हैं. तो आई एग्री उनकी, मुझे आई कैन कंप्लीटली कॉम्प्रीहेंड हिज फ्रस्ट्रेशन. मैं सिर्फ डॉक्टर इशरत हुसैन की जो करंट इंस्टीट्यूशनल रिफॉर्म सेल वाली जो रिकमेंडेशंस थी उसके ऊपर कमेंट कर सकती हूँ, बिकॉज आई हैव बीन अ पार्ट ऑफ इट. तो जो पिछली रिपोर्ट्स थी, वो जो फर्स्ट डॉक्टर इशरत हुसैन की रिपोर्ट थी वो भी पड़ी रही. 2 साल तक उन्होंने इंतजार किया एंड देन ही जस्ट गॉट अप एंड लेफ्ट. उसी से लेसन ड्रॉ करते हुए उन्होंने अपनी जो करंट रिफॉर्म एफर्ट है उसमें ये स्ट्रेटजी अडॉप्ट की कि जो प्रपोजल टास्क फोर्स से थ्रू हो जाती थी उसको वो एज इट इज ले जाते थे कैबिनेट में. सो फॉर एग्जांपल, इंडक्शन और ट्रेनिंग की समरी एक दफा अप्रूव हो गई, परफॉर्मेंस मैनेजमेंट की दूसरी दफा हो गई, तीसरी दफा कुछ और हो गई. So instead of taking this huge report for approval to the cabinet and not getting anywhere with that by the end of the day, he got some of the things notified by the federal cabinet. So we can't really say that about the current report. जो एक बाद में क्वेश्चन आया था रिगार्डिंग ट्रेनिंग कि जी ट्रेनिंग में नॉन सीरियस होते हैं, it could be true for a few years back, but it's no more true because I am myself a part of a training institute, and I've recently 2 years ago I did my NMC, so I know how seriously these trainings are taken now because they have a substantial weightage in your promotion mechanism. So nobody really takes these trainings non-seriously. Everyone is committed and serious and wants to perform well because these have greater weightage than before. जो lateral entry की बात हुई थी, I think उसमें National Executive Service की proposal जब introduce हो जाएगी, तो this might be addressed, but I'm not sure because I'm not fully aware of the details of that proposal National Executive Service. जो कहा गया कि कोई सीनियर ब्यूरोक्रेट यहाँ होते और वो आंसर करते इन चीजों को, और कोई 25-30 साल की सर्विस का तजुर्बा होता, तो आई कैन टेल दैट जेंटलमैन कि मेरा भी 25 साल का तजुर्बा है. If you can, I have been in the service for more than 25 years, so if you can consider me, experienced enough or qualified enough to talk about this. Obviously, I'm not the final word on anything or claim to be the wisest person, but I have had a number of years. Thank you so much, Dr.
But Samina बीबी, इसमें एक छोटी सी चीज मैं कह दूं कि ये एक थोड़ा सा पजल तो है कि हमारे ब्यूरोक्रेट्स माशाल्लाह बिल्कुल ठीक कह रही हैं कि they are very well trained and they've been to Harvard and they've been to many places and mashallah they have many PhDs and many MAs. But I'll tell you one thing, I have arranged webinar seminars in the Planning Commission auditorium. I've arranged conferences there. And who is absent? No bureaucrat ever turns up. हम वेबिनार कराते हैं, no bureaucrat ever turns up. मैं IMF में 30 साल रहा हूँ. It was mandatory on all our departments to have a seminar. And everybody turned up. World Bank में आप चले जाएं, UN में चले जाएं, everybody turns up for seminars. Even the managing director turns up, even the World Bank president turns up. तो ये क्या learning coefficient है? आप लोग क्या training में सिखाते हैं कि अगर के मतलब मैं मान जाऊं, एक आधा मान जाऊं, but they don't turn up to any seminar. हाँ, ये बात है, अगर वर्ल्ड बैंक बुलाए, डोनर बुलाए तो पहुंच जाते हैं सब, बट अगर यूनिवर्सिटी बुलाएं तो नहीं आते. तो हमारा ये भी तो एक कल्चर बन गया है ना, तो ये भी तो सोचने वाली बात है. तो ये मेरा ख्याल आप ट्रेनिंग एकेडमी में जरूर सिखाएं, हम ट्रेनिंग का
Point duly noted, and I think motivation का issue है और capacity building तो एक lifetime चीज है. इसमें कोई भी ये नहीं claim कर सकता कि अब मैंने इतना सीख लिया है कि मुझे किसी और सेमिनार की या ट्रेनिंग की जरूरत नहीं है. And I'll definitely for my next batches I'll make sure that all of them, my senior management courses and middle management courses, attend your webinars, Dr. Saab.
Thank you. अच्छा जी, हुमैरा बेबी, your turn, your last final words, your answers, etc.
My final words तो नहीं होंगे, काफी सारे मौके मिलेंगे आपसे डिस्कशन के लिए, inshallah, on various issues of national security, definitely. I think what Dr. Ishrat Hussain has done so far, that I've gone through his reform papers and at the induction level and at the with respect to promotions and this National Executive Service and making the exams separately for various groups. I think that's a good initiative, and we have to let that reform take ground somewhere. But first, we have to make sure that the purpose of the reform is service delivery, is development of Pakistan as a country, and the civil servants being more responsive to the problems of common citizens. And if these reforms are not accompanied with simultaneous reforms at the local government level, giving more autonomy, and the change in the structure of the way the ministries work and the rules of business, then it is not going to give the results that we are intending to have. This reform, I think, is taken, it has been drafted after efforts of 2 years. Now PTI government is in the 3rd year. So there are 2 more years left to see where, because somebody has to implement the first part of at the induction level. And then you have to go and make simultaneous changes at all levels, because he said it's a value chain that they are going to improve. So the reform has to go simultaneously in all the sectors. Plus, you need a transition plan for the people who are right now serving in different groups. This reform plan has to give some exit to those who are not functional and who are not performing. And I hope the people who are more qualified and who are trained, they don't get disheartened and start leaving the government if the reform is not giving the right kind of expected results. So I think the first point is to let the report go and follow the normal course of approvals of government of Pakistan, because it will take at least 3 to 4 years for the reform process to sink in. And you will start seeing the results in another 2-3 years. So somewhere we have to start with the reform, because if we keep continuing looking at the rear view mirror, we are going to have an accident. So since I work in sensitive areas of terrorism and violent extremism, and I see more and more youth becoming disgruntled, and they're losing hope in the service delivery and in government. So I think it's a point of concern. And I once again repeat that I think civil services is the backbone of the country. They are an important pillar of your national security alongside the defense forces. And the sooner overhauling is done, the better. Thank you.
Well put, well put. Ji, Sameen?
Thank you. I'm a little amused. I think mere naam mein doctor nahi hai, so people have forgotten I'm an academic. But and I've been enjoying that discussion on having PhD, dominating the civil service. In my experience, having a PhD does not mean you can do well in a because the role that civil servants play is not necessarily something that you learn from getting a PhD. But I mean, so there are some PhDs who are civil servants, absolutely, काफी prominent positions में भी लोग होते हैं, but PhD should not equal civil service. On a serious note, someone asked in the chat box about the role of donors in the civil, in terms of making policy and so on and so forth. I think इसकी justification जो दी जा bureaucracy doesn't have the capacity to some degrees, and in some places this is true. So for instance, अगर आप बलूचिस्तान की civil service को देखेंगे तो वाकई वहाँ पे serious capacity gaps हैं, and that is a failure of the state in terms of allocating resources. But I do agree with you that the role of the donors needs to be thought through. Unfortunately, you can't do that when you are dependent on them for your finances. So the example that I was giving of irrigation management transfer, if you have a donor recommending a policy which you know is going to be problematic, magar donor keh raha hai that you have to implement it and you have to push it through, then you're kind of in a bind. So until you're able to sort out your economy, I don't think you can push back against the donor community and say, ji, hame aapki help nahi chahiye. So for instance, with the coronavirus response, you had a lot of support from the WHO and the World Bank and the ADB. We're not going to turn our backs to that. So I think that the policy advice then becomes part and parcel of that conversation. Someone, Tahir Saab, I think mentioned, the role that bureaucrats can play in terms of undermining politicians, undermining other bureaucrats. Absolutely, 100%. When I was doing my PhD thesis, a lot of my fieldwork revealed exactly this, that bureaucrats can often undermine people because, there's always a personal interest involved somewhere. There's not a lot of people who can be completely selfless and say that, no matter where the chips fall, I'm going to do the right thing. So often you will have these kinds of personal interests intervening. I think I just wanted to close on this note of local autonomy. I think one of the reasons that a lot of academics, at least, found the Punjab local government law and the KP local government law is so interesting and so ambitious and so, we look forward to them being implemented was precisely because they allowed cities, for instance, a level of autonomy. So Nadeem Al-Haq Saab was talking about managing cities. So if you have directly elected mayors, as is envisioned, for example, in the Punjab law, that will change the relationship that citizens have with that elected representative when he's directly or she is directly represented, and of course the relationship that bureaucrats have with them. So I don't know exactly when those elections will be held and when those changes will be brought about, but that will produce some interesting results, which maybe might work in tandem with some of these civil service reforms. But I think one of the major things that from an academic standpoint has been problematic is that, unlike India, for example, our government does not make data easily accessible to, for example, academics. So if I wanted to find out bureaucrats के transfers PS level पे या 21st या 20th grade के transfers कितने हुए हैं, किस frequency में से हुए हैं, या what was the transition of a bureaucrat from the point of entry to the point of retirement, Pakistan government is not going to give me this information. The Indian government does provide access to this kind of data, so there's a lot more work, a lot more analysis, and a lot more research done on the Indian bureaucracy, just as a comparative example. So, I mean, I think it would be in the Pakistan government's interest to make some of this data available. I think they're getting better at it, and I think some of these reforms might improve that, so that we can do some research and provide some recommendations. Uske bagair to we're kind of shooting in the dark. So, I mean, unless I go and I speak to every single person myself, or I go and I look at the boards and the daftars, jo wooden boards hote hain ki ji kiska transfer kab hua tha, I can't find that data. So if you look at the work of Dr. Shahana Aman Rana, who is an economist in Virginia, that is what she did. Because how else are you going to get this data? So you have to have this stuff being publicly available to do any research, to make any recommendations. I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, folks. Thank you very much. It's been a great discussion. Obviously, we can't reach a conclusion because this is too important a subject and a very, very difficult subject to navigate. Every country, as I said, needs a civil service. Every corporation needs a civil service. Every tribe needs a civil service. I've been watching Arthrugul these days, and yes, even Arthrugul had a civil service. So a civil service is the most important institution in a country. And we, as I said, Asimoglu and Robinson have shown, and many people have shown, lots of research, that institutions are the most important thing for economic growth. So when we discuss the civil service, I know Musharraf bent over backwards to caveat it. Let me repeat the caveat, and I'll never say it again, that nobody's criticizing any group. This is not a personal thing. But every country needs a superior civil service, one of the best in the world, a learning civil service. And I use the word learning advisedly, a researching civil service, a thinking civil service, not decision-making, not telling people that we want to attest your ID cards and do this to you, do that to you. And our job is, as academics, as thinkers, as society, civil society, our job is to help create that system for the welfare of ourselves, our children, our society. Pakistan is going to lag behind if we don't develop modern structures. If we continue to have structures looking for attestations, we will not make it. So we must think about that, and I think we will continue this journey. We will have more webinars, more discussion on this, and I told Ishrat Hussain that just like we did on education, we'll call him at the end of our journey to take all the comments and questions and to tell us what he's doing, because obviously he's doing some good work, as many of the speakers said, and it's important to have him on board. But our conversation must go independently of the government effort. This is how civilized society behaves everywhere. And all we are trying to do is create a conversation, just like we did on energy, just like we did on education, just like we did on many other subjects. So we are doing that on civil service. We'll do that on the judiciary too at some point, as I said, very soon. And we're going to do it on all areas of Pakistan. And that is the job of a think tank and of all universities. And I'm glad all universities are joining us in webinars. Please focus on these issues, because trying to do what the donors are doing, all kinds of crazy subjects that don't mean anything, we must study our own institutions and understand them. Thank you, folks. I admire you for taking your time out, and I thank all the speakers from the bottom of my heart. Inshallah, we'll repeat it. All the best to you. Khuda Hafiz.